So I'll start with sort of the 30,000-foot level. I work with healthy democracy, so I'm very interested in what Brian mentioned, an aspect of participatory budgeting is, and that is improving the quality of democracy. So I'm going to ask, starting with Jess, and we can just work our way down, what is the one most important way that you feel like participatory budgeting has improved the quality of democracy from your perspective in your community?
I think a way that, or something that has been improved is actually getting engagement from the different voices that haven't been historically heard. I think that's really important moving forward, knowing that in the future, as we become a more diverse society in America, it's important to have different voices and bring them to the table instead of like building different barriers that tend to leave them out. So building bridges and actually connecting with those in the community is really important.
I would definitely agree with that, and especially with Seattle, youth have been more engaged, I think, since the program. I'd also say the community meetings we've had for idea generation, for recruiting budget delegates have kind of been an impetus for people to reflect more on how they can be engaged in deciding the budget of the city, deciding where their tax money goes. So that has kind of shown people that they really can make a difference.
When I think about sort of how these programs have improved the quality of democracy, I would say that it's created an additional institutional space for non-traditional actors to have a voice. Mobilizations and protests are often have an important role. I mean, you can think about Black Lives Matter, you can think about some of the women's marches, the anti-gun and the violence marches that have been going on. Those are important spaces for one type of public, for affecting the public debate, but having an institutional space for new types of actors, I think, has been one of the key advances of these programs.
Thank you.
And I would say one of the biggest things is connecting politicians with a stronger relationship to their communities that they serve, allowing space for new voices and new leadership from the community ranks.
We need to change how democracy is functioning now. I think that is very clear on all scales of government. What does participatory budgeting, participatory democracy do? It creates a new mode of governance, and it challenges the status quo. I know in my experience just in the city of Seattle, when I've been going out and engaging folks around parks and streets, especially particularly within communities of color, I have young people of color that tell me, why should I care about parks and streets? I'm getting pushed out, I got massive student debt, police brutality, and I'm like, I hear you, I entirely hear you, and this is why participatory budgeting is a tool, but what would it look like for us to apply participatory budgeting to criminal justice reform? You know, what would it look like for us to address the prison industrial complex by changing how funding is allocated and distributed? And that project, I want folks to think about that as a framework for something much larger and bigger than filling a pothole or getting a crosswalk.
The most robust cases that we've seen is around about 100% of discretionary spending. And if you do that over a 5-6 year period, it starts to add up to real money where you can begin to sort of think about medium-sized infrastructure project, housing projects, some transportation changes. Beyond that, it becomes really difficult because you start addressing personnel, debt, and general maintenance. And so I've seen cities claim they do 100% of the budget, but when you actually begin to look at it more closely, the most that's sort of realistic, what I think of sort of realistic, is 100% of discretionary spending to do that. But I think the effort is to try to think about to maybe think about sort of the example like Paris, where they're doing $100 million a year. How do you go from $3 million a year in Seattle to 120 million in Paris? And what types of spending, what type of resources are available? What's the structure that is possible?
You mentioned that a lot of people, especially politicians, once they get into a position of power, they don't want to give away their power. And budgeting is like a very powerful tool at the disposal of elected officials. So you as a representative of people, right? How did your role change in advocating for participatory budgeting, because we're going to be pushing agencies, both local, public agencies, elected officials here, to push for participatory budgeting. But in a sense, it's also kind of asking them to give up some of their power. So, yeah, how did your role evolve?
That's a great question. I would say, for me, my values was well in lockstep with the community. Like I said, I was a college professor, and so I knew what the power PB could do. When I went out to communities, and I went to mosques, I went to churches, I went to barbershops, I went to salons, and I just started talking about what PB is. I went to other government entities and tried to get them to understand what PB and the value that it has in the community to get more people involved. I didn't go in saying, give me your power. That's the wrong approach. But I went in there as an elected official in the city of Greensboro, trying to get more people of color and others at the table. I would tell you, in some parts of the community, I walk in, Hispanic Latino community, they would shut the door, they wouldn't even talk to me. So I didn't have an approach, so I had to think, how do I get them involved? And they've been calling me and emailing me about they need bus transportation and they need other services. How do I get them involved into the table? And so it was really meeting them where they are and really talking about the advantages of PB and really democracy. If we're truly about the work of democracy and providing voices to the people, I used to tell them, I got represented by the people, so I represent you. I'm your voice. And so that's the work, and that's where I come from. And so I used to come and say, those are my values, this is why I'm here, and let's see what we can do to bring you across. Because a lot of politicians just didn't believe in, well, that's a waste of tax dollars, that's a waste of resources. Why should we put $500,000 to aside to buy some chessboards in the park? That doesn't make sense. We could put that money over here to build more sidewalks, or put that money over here to rehab this old building. But it's just trying to get elected officials to understand, why they were elected and who they serve and the people that they want to continue to serve if they want to still be in that role.
Question. I have a follow-up question about the $50,000 chessboard controversy, shall we say. So clearly the group wanted that, and clearly there were some reasons why that was difficult from the city standpoint. Could you tell us how you worked through that and what the value of having that kind of unforeseen, perhaps, difficulty was?
I would say a lot of people on council with their values, and a lot of us stated, hey, this is what your community and your district wanted, we should move forward and do it. But the representative, he was a very conservative person in his district. And he felt like, we need to conserve those dollars. And his goal was, you know what? I remember nights he said, Jamal, I need your vote. Let's take that $50,000 and, buy $50,000 of macaroni and cheese for the homeless and the needy in our community to feed them. And I said, well, that's not a bad idea, but that's going against the voices of the people. And so that's how a lot of us on council looked at it, and it actually went to 2 or 3 meetings with this topic coming up. And so what we said is, city manager, go and look at and give us the cost of how much is it truly going to cost us $50,000. Can we look at doing something cheaper but still meet the goals of the community? And that's what we did. And so the excess dollars of that $50,000 we took, and we met the council member, what his goal was, and bought some food for the community. I would say from a council perspective, the projects that were voted on and ready to move forward, it's all about timing. So they'll move forward, but we might not could do all the projects within this fiscal year, so it may get phased in. And that's how we looked at trying to get majority of the projects through, is phasing in and make sure that we can balance the budget with as many projects as possible.
Let me just add on to that. I think there's this tension in a lot of the programs between sort of what you could think of as sort of the language of quick wins or smaller projects versus something that takes 2 or 3, 4 years. So one of the things is that some of the larger projects and sort of some, especially some of the social service projects that may be implemented, if you vote in 2018, they may not arrive till 2020 or 2021. And so I think as people are thinking about this, there's a benefit for governments to sort of encourage projects that can be implemented the following year, because you can sort of see that direct connection. But then there's also a benefit to try to sort of saying, well, it's actually, some of the bigger projects may not come for 2 years or for a third year. So trying to sort of think about sort of the spacing out of projects over a number of years, sort of the size and the resources would be the difference when they're implemented. I think the emphasis on the youth is really an effort to try to return to that civic engagement piece, to think about how we can create citizens, how we can create individuals who can engage and who are knowledgeable about the engagement process. So I think the PB in high schools, or the youth PB, is really situated around that. I don't know if either of you two can speak to that. The other thing that we've also really found is that these processes, especially with the budget delegates, the budget type delegates, create a new generation of leaders who have a much broader base of knowledge. This is in the United States, but this is also across the world. So one of the things, so short term, it has this positive effect. There could be a long-term negative where you're just sort of, you're creating a new sense of an old guard, but the initial point is that you are sort of trying to expand the base of non-traditional actors, the base of knowledge among non-traditional actors, so that they can begin to engage this process. So some of the survey work that we did in Brazil, we found that holding workshops and doing education for these budget delegates was much more important than doing workshops for the average citizen who just wanted to vote. So the average citizen, if you just got him or her to go out and vote, that was positive because they're engaging, they're thinking about it. But the information that is being passed to and then used by new or traditional communities as well as new community leaders is a real vital part of the process. That's a great question. I think New York City has really taken the lead in developing programs that appeal to resident in the sense of somebody who lives in the city or works in the city, as opposed to a reference to their legal status. And so I think a lot of the language around resident meant an individual as opposed to legal status. I think the effort in Chicago and New York City, going back to those two cases that I know best here, there's been a real effort to do a lot of translation of documents into other languages, as well as making it clear that voting is eligible to anybody who's above a certain age. So in the Chicago case, in the first district that we mentioned, Joe Moore is the city council member, they made a real effort to reach out to the Latino population, many of whom, so there's a combination of U.S. citizens, legal residents, and non-legal residents. So I think there's been a real effort to try to sort of reach out, and that I think comes down to the government and the community organizations of who they're going to reach out to. What's the recruitment process to bring people into the forums?
Amy?
From a Seattle perspective, we don't require ID to vote. We actually don't ask citizenship at all. We don't ask for your address. We ask for a name, and we, again, recognizing that Seattle is in an affordable housing crisis, a homelessness crisis, that while you may not live in that neighborhood, that doesn't mean that you don't belong to that neighborhood. So that's why we let folks choose which district to vote in. And we do not require address or citizenship status. And we put a lot of our budget and emphasis in language access.
Try to address everybody in this question. Brian, I think at the beginning you noted the importance of having institutional support behind participatory budgeting in terms of its impact. And I was wondering if we could compare unique outcomes in Greensboro and Seattle. Councilor, when you were speaking, it sounded like in Greensboro there was more of a bottom-up push, folks coming to City Council to push for this process, whereas in Seattle there was the Youth Commission and a lot of institutional support from the Department of Neighborhoods. I was wondering if that had any divergent outcomes or any highlights you can share?
That we've been able to identify is that the best outcomes is when you are able to sort of create, at the initial starting point, a joint collaboration among government officials and civil society organizations, or community organizations. So sometimes it's the case that it's a city council member, he or she goes off and learns about it and brings it back in. Other times it's a community organization that brings it up. So I think there's not a lot of evidence that really demonstrates that, you know, one way is better than the other, but there is evidence that demonstrates just trying to have that collaboration, especially at the founding moment, is really crucial. The advantage of doing it in an executive-led model or citywide is there over time more resources develop, and you can sort of have a bigger scope. You can begin to think about, okay, what we want to do is we want to have a combination of neighborhood focus and a combination of bigger types of projects. When it's district focused, like the single member district in a city council office, those programs tend to be at smaller scale and can't grow as much. So they're trying to be creative in New York of doing some different ways of growing, but until the mayor or the executive sort of takes it on, you're sort of constrained. The Mexico City, one of the things they did is that they did, because Mexico City is sort of this multiple jurisdictions, municipal level jurisdictions, is they actually created a valley-wide PB process that connected different municipalities, and they're trying to figure out ways to sort of solve some of these issues in common that run across different municipalities. There's been some examples of environmental groups, for example, trying to use PB that, again, is not tied to the municipality, but more of a sort of a watershed region in order to sort of think about how resources could be spent in that area. So I think that sort of going back to sort of to your question, it's sort of this thinking about sort of this joint tie between government and community organizations at the beginning.
Yes. 40 years ago in Greensboro, we went from what Portland has today. We had 7 white men that ran our city. And we tried to do a form of PB then of getting community members to understand the budget. It wasn't going anywhere. It didn't happen until the community with the NAACP and other organizations standing up and fighting to change our form of government. And that's why we got a 5-3-1 system today. And with that system, that opened up to 2 minority districts out of the 5 that's represented. Our first black mayor was in 2007. From 1940 when Greensboro was created, or 1840 when Greensboro was created. So there's a lot of similarities. I would say as a community, PB is created within a community and for that community. And so the ideas and things that you heard today, Portland or Gresham or Troutdale, you're going to have to create PB for your community. But one of the things is, I would say, a city manager form of government, if the community stood up and said, hey, we need to change our form of government, I would say, yes, tomorrow. That will help, because having that citywide concept, efficiencies and effectiveness, I would say 2 weeks ago, Durham, North Carolina, they just voted, and they see PB as a great resource for their community. When you start looking at areas like Richmond, Virginia, and others, Richmond, Virginia changed their form of government in 2004, 2005 for some of the same situations going on in their community. And so that may be an avenue that the community members throughout the Portland region look at, is your form of government and how effective is that form of government, because it's commission-based.
Go ahead, Amy.
And so Seattle is actually, we just concluded in this last election cycle our second round of district-based city council voting. So we have 7 council districts and 2 at-large positions. And right now we have a majority woman of color city council. I mean, it's amazing. And it speaks to that power, and you hear it, how the discourse has changed within the committees and in their conversations on the dais.
Jamal, and that is going to be the last question. So I just want to thank again the panel for their incredible expertise.